Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our wrapping up of our discussion about the European exploration period, right? So, big thing about it is I have started grading your tests, right? So I've started grading your tests. They are taking me a little bit longer than I thought they would. So a lot of it has to just do with the fact that I'm just getting used to grading writing again and stuff like that. But the big thing about it though is so far, so good, okay? So far, a lot of y'all are looking like you're kind of figuring things out. You're learning how to study for this pretty equitably, which is really, really good. The other big thing about it though is as well, when I get them done, if you want to come swing in and check on them or look at them or something like that, you'll get that opportunity in class. But if you want to get a little bit more of an in-depth reason as to why certain answers are certain answers, my S period is always available, right? But the big thing about it is we're now moving into our next unit, right? The next unit in the AP European History curriculum, which is going to be the end of exploration stuff and then going into the Renaissance, or not the Renaissance, we just talked about that, the Reformation period, right? And the Reformation period is going to be analyzing the growth of Christianity and its splitting off into several different factions, right? So we'll talk about that, and a lot of you are a little bit connected to it as well, just like I am, because we're going to be talking about the Reformation period from the perspective of actually our classroom a little bit as well, because some of us in the room are not Catholic, i.e. me, right? Was not raised Catholic, was raised Protestant. We'll talk about why that is, where that movement started, and how it got really, really kicked off. But the big thing we got to do is got to wrap up the last unit and kind of like put a little bow on it and just kind of go ahead and talk about the effects of exploration more than anything else, right? We're going to be talking a lot today about the expansion of the commercial economy, moving away from subsistence-based economics, and then also going into the creation of joint stock companies, right? So the big thing about it is let's pick up right where we left off when we had our last class together, right? And the thing we started talking about was the expansion of the Transatlantic trade network, right? And we talked about this a little bit in class. We talked about how when you were little, you probably learned about the Transatlantic trade network kind of like this, right? Usually probably heard about it in the sense of the triangle trade or the triangular trade whenever you were younger, probably like 4th or 5th grade. And you probably began to talk about how now the fact that there are colonies being established on the actual North-South American region of the world. You've got raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and other things like that going back to Europe. Europe is processing them and sending them towards Africa with textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa, where they are then actually trading for slaves that will then also be brought across the Atlantic into the New World colonies, right? Well, the thing about it in the large, grand scheme of things is actually it looks way more like this, right? This network is not a simple triangular flow. It actually goes back and forth in every single direction. As you can see, that rum, iron, and gunpowder, cloth, and tools heading back to Africa from the colonies. Tons of different things like lumber, furs, whale oil, rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, sugar, molasses, wood. All those raw materials in massive amounts are now heading back to Europe. Not just cotton and rice and tobacco, right? Like, it's a massively, very, very sophisticated system that actually, even this map right here, is missing an entire arrow because you actually have huge amounts of silk, spices, and other Eastern goods now coming from the Indian Ocean area as well. So the Transatlantic Trade Network, though, is a little bit of a better name for it because, as you can see, it's extremely complex and it flows in every single different direction. So the other thing that you need to understand is having a more comprehensive look at that. If you were to break it down by region, you would just basically cook it down to this idea. Europe's got the processed stuff, America's got the raw materials, and from Africa you're seeing coming from that area the expansion of the slave trade. Now, we talked about this briefly as well in class. Why did the slave trade boom around the late to mid 1600s? Well, the reason why is because plantation economics are growing and the failing encomienda system is killing off the native population. So first of all, before we begin this conversation, this is a very, very important piece of the AP European History curriculum, as it should be, because the things that we're about to talk about, including the Transatlantic African Slave Trade Network, is one of the most disgusting things that has ever happened in the series of history. That and the encomienda, to me, are two of the biggest things that equate themselves close to a genocide that a lot of people do not actually talk about the way they should be talked about, right? Well, the thing about it is the reason why the slave trade rocketed forward during the 1600s is because the encomienda system is killing off the native population that's being used to work and labor on those plantations. The plantations and the mines specifically, right? The mines being used to gather gold and silver, and the plantations being heavily used in the Caribbean to farm sugarcane. Now, as things grow and progress forward, something that you're going to notice is that you're going to see some slaves being brought in mostly to the Caribbean. They were literally known at the time as the Sugar Islands, right? Now, also, just to give you a little understanding as well, what country was mostly responsible for the movement and trafficking of these people actually falls into the hands of the Portuguese, right? Because the Portuguese, as we remember, under Henry the Navigator, were the ones that bounced around the coast of Africa to try and get past past the Cape of Good Hope to get into the Indian Ocean. And in that process, they created slave trade forts, right? Now, the thing about it is slaves were brought during this time period in massive numbers, 500 people per boat sometimes, primarily by the Portuguese as their spice trade in India began to fail, okay? So now we'll talk about that on our next couple of slides and stuff like that. We're actually going to talk about a little bit today how the Portuguese are going to get ousted out of the Indian Ocean, particularly by the Dutch and the British, okay? And of course, that will actually equate to the trip and stuff that we take when we actually talk about later on, when we go to Amsterdam, you'll actually see the markings of that and the growth of the Dutch spice trade and stuff like that. But the big thing about it, though, is slaves were brought in massive numbers as the Portuguese spice trade began to fail. Now, 90% of those people actually went to mostly the Caribbean or to Brazil, all right? And that's important to kind of just know that, too, as being a resident of North America. A lot of times in schools and stuff like that, we always hear this one idea where it's like, oh, it's like this is just a North American like issue in history. No, this is a world issue, right? The slave trade was a worldwide issue, and it is a disgusting mark on the world history of things, right? And also, a big thing about it that you need to understand is that the conditions aboard these boats were absolutely horrific, right? And as you can see right here, the thicker the line, the larger number of people were actually brought from Africa and trafficked to those regions, right? So as you can see, there's a heavy African-based population in South America, and to this day, there is actually a very heavy Latin American, African descendant-based Latin American population in like places like Brazil, Argentina, and then also in areas as well as going as far north as as far north as Colombia, and then going into Central and South America, and also into the Caribbean. Now, the thing about it though is these like this area right here, this movement, this route right there is oftentimes referred to as the Middle Passage, right? Go ahead and jot that down as well. The Middle Passage is the trek that the slaves would actually take from the west coast of Africa after they were traded at slave forts and then brought to North and South America. Now, this is another big thing as well that you need to understand is when the creation of the slave trade actually occurred, the Europeans were taking advantage of the sub-Saharan African societies that actually did not have certain types of developed tools and developed manufactured goods as well. So what was originally going on when the Europeans actually created this slave trade base is they were going up to tribal Africans and trading the tribal Africans items like guns and cloth and cash and gold and things like that and manufactured goods to these tribal leaders in exchange for people. Because as we know in tribal societies, oftentimes in the subject of war, whenever a losing side would actually lose, they would ultimately become slaves of the winners, right? And so the thing about it is that the African societies were actually using people as currency for the actual Europeans. But then as time progresses, getting close to the 16 and 1700s, the Europeans then began to enslave those winners, right? And steal people directly from their homelands, literally capturing them and placing them on boats and moving them towards North and South America. Now, many times the slaves that actually referred to these boats as floating coffins, as in the idea that you were already dead the moment that you boarded them, because as you can see on this map right here, the conditions aboard them were absolutely disgusting. Literally, they were laid down and chained together, okay? And they were also prevented from ever using the bathroom. The disease spread rampantly on these like boats as well, and sometimes 50%, as large of a number as 50% in some cases on these slave vessels, died from gross mistreatment, starvation, or disease. You even had accounts, apparently, of people literally giving birth to children on these things, and they would sometimes consider killing the child so the child would actually avoid having to go into slavery, right? And then once they actually, if they made it off this several-week voyage across the Atlantic on these Portuguese slave vessels, if they actually survived the entire trip, they were then ripped apart from their families and sold in stock separately, right? And the entire groups and families and entire cultures in Africa would be eradicated because of the conditions and the also like the system of slave trade that was going on through this time period. Now, how do we know about this stuff? How do we know about the conditions aboard them? Well, there's actually a very famous individual that wrote his autobiography by the name of Oluda Equiano. And Oluda Equiano actually gave us the most like diagraphic and most literal sense of an autobiography about his journey from the west coast of Africa all the way to a plantation in South Carolina. So as you can see, we have direct from the people that experienced like actual accounts of all of this, like these endeavors, right? So also though, as you can go, wait, back up, there we go. Also, as you can see as well, the conditions aboard them were absolutely terrible. And in the process, 12.5 million men, women, and children were actually taken away from Africa and then brought to the Americas on slave vessels. And in the process of the slave trade, we believe that somewhere in the neighborhood of million people are believed to have died en route due to the gross mistreatment of the slave trade in this time period, right? And so that is going to create a huge slave-based economic system and plantation economic system in the New World colonies, okay? Now, going forward as well, you have to understand there's some other major effects when it comes to the exploration period, especially when it comes down to the economic factors of its major effects. Now, this is one of the biggest ones that you need to understand, the Columbian Exchange, right? Now, we talked about this a little bit in class the other day because I was geeking out about the fact that Italians have only been cooking with tomatoes for a couple of hundred years. And y'all were probably like, why is this guy talking about food so much? It was to give you an intellectual base about the Columbian Exchange, because what we're about to talk about right now is super, super important, and the AP test loves to ask about it. And you should understand it because it literally explains why people eat certain things in certain countries if those things did not naturally grow there at first. Well, it all boils down to the fact that the Europeans had no idea that North and South America were there, and the North and South Americans had no idea that Europe was over there. And there are certain crops and animals and things that grow on these separate sides of the world that now that we have made contact are going to begin to exchange to either side. For example, from North America, from the Americas, you're going to see sweet potatoes being one of the biggest and most important crops that actually gets transferred over because potatoes are wicked important, like super important.
I'm a potato. Super awesome nature. Dancing, classy, and sassy.
Like, see how big of a deal potatoes are? So the thing about it, though, is you got potatoes, corn, sweet potatoes, squash, pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, cashews, cacao for chocolate, and all these other different items, and especially a major, major cash crop, tobacco, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, is going to make its way now over to Europe. And then from Europe, you're going to see the transportation of things like honeybees, rats, hooray, grains, wheat, sugarcane, olives, cabbage, onions, and of course, most importantly, disease going over to the other side of the world, right? That is the Columbian Exchange. And just to give you a heads up, it wasn't a formal thing. It wasn't like sat down and decided to do. It actually happened pretty much as a fruition of these different trade agreements and trade negotiations going from the two different sectors of the world. Because as colonies begin to pop up, they begin to move crops from the old world to these new colonies so they can grow them there and test out their ability to create some plantation economic systems off of them. Now, what you're going to see though, because of the Columbian Exchange and the growth of new products all over the world, is you're going to see the growth of this concept known as consumerism, okay? So something that you have to understand about Europeans in general leading up into about the 1500s is they were mostly subsistence style economic patterns, okay? So now let's talk about that really quick. Now in Europe, feudalism is a really great example of a subsistence style economic pattern, right? In feudal systems, I think it was Alexander that emailed me asking some questions about how feudalism actually relates to economic systems. It was a really great question, Alexander. I really appreciate you asking me about it. But the thing about it is it has to do with the fact that feudalism is a subsistence style economic system. What that means is they grow enough to stay alive and then for the Lord to sell off enough crops so that he can make some money. Now, in this process, you're not making tons and tons and tons of extra stuff. You're not getting paid like a wage for your extra work and things like that. You're doing just enough to stay alive. But now, because of the Columbian Exchange, what you're going to see is the growth of something known as consumerism, where there are new products coming in that no one's ever seen before. Chocolate is going to be tasted by Europeans for the very first time. Tobacco is going to be used by Europeans for the very first time. You're going to see potatoes, sweet potatoes, all these new crops coming in through these new ports. Well, what's going to happen is people are going to try and find ways to work extra on the side to make money to go out and buy those things. Because what consumerism is the dramatic increase in trade and trade goods, the Columbian Exchange goods we were just talking about, which resulted in a massive economic boom in the growth of Europe, okay? So an economic growth in Europe. It's because it's literally just going to dynamically change the way everything is structured. Other key effects of the Columbian Exchange, of the colonies popping up, of consumerism, of the growth in economic systems as well, a big one is going to be inflation. You're going to see the rise in prices for a lot of things depending on their supply and demand, right? So going into it as well, something you need to understand is because of the massive amount of gold and silver coming in through the ports, because it's coming from the mines in North and South America, people are going to have more money available to them. And if there's more money available to them, people are actual capital gains, or not capital gains, what's the word I'm looking for? Business owners, there we go. Business owners, bankers, lenders, and all the other people that actually control certain economic factors in Europe are going to raise their prices because they know you have more money in your pocket. Now, the interesting thing about it is that the silver and gold coming in through the ports of Spain actually is going to leak into the rest of Europe. Things like, for example, it's going to end up in England and France in the hands of other individuals as well. But the thing about it is, just go ahead and write this down. This is going to be really, really big later on, is inflation is actually going to crush the power of Spain a little bit later on, because they actually ended up with too much money at one point. Supply and demand economics is going to be a big one, though, as well. For example, this is going to be a great thing that we talk about a little bit later on. Like when we talk about like the availability of an item, right? If you have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of potatoes are going to be inexpensive, right? Because the demand is not high enough and the supply is very overwhelming, right? And then also on the flip side, if something is increasingly rare, like spices used to be, right? That meant that the demand on them was very, very high, and it meant that actually you could charge more because it's all about who wants it more. Now, the interesting thing about it, though, is that supply-demand economics is changing with spices because you now have tons of spices coming in through the ports, so the prices on them are beginning to go down, right? So you're seeing that consumerism pop up. And another huge thing that's going to be happening due to the consumer effects and the actual commercial effects of the expiration period is you're going to see the power of monarchs grow even more, okay? The power of royals and monarchs is going to get even bigger because they're going to start adopting this concept known as mercantilism, all right? So monarchs and monarchies are going to grow their power because now with more money circulating through society, they can tax people more. And if they can tax more, that puts more money into their pocket, and it gives them more money to fund things like professional militaries we'll talk about later, the creation of postal services, the increased road systems and infrastructure that will give them the ability to tax more efficiently, right? But just know that with all this new money, goods, and stuff coming in through the ports, monarchs are getting even more powerful during a time when they were already on the uptick anyway, right? And mercantilism, what that means is you're going to see literally monarchs start getting greedy, okay? Now, this is really, really important. Mercantilism, we're going to talk about it a little bit now, and we're going to talk about it a lot a bit in about 2 units from now, okay? Because monarchs, particularly absolutists, when they start popping up in the 1600s, will adopt a concept known as mercantilism, which is like capitalism's worst nightmare, okay? Capitalism is a free market economy where people of any country can trade with people of any other country depending on the supply, demand, and also the cost of certain goods and services, right? Whereas in mercantilism, you are actually trying to hoard as much money and funds inside the borders of your country as possible. So basically, the monarchs are going to start trying to say, no, you cannot trade with other people. You may not buy French goods if you are English, because they are trying to keep the money hoarded inside of the country itself to grow the personal wealth of the country in its essence, okay? But we'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. But just so you understand, we got mother countries and colonies getting very, very rich off things like gold, silver, foodstuffs, and raw materials during this time point. Now, the next thing that I'm about to throw up here is kind of an infographic for the imitrans of the world, because I know we were talking about how like people flow together and stuff like that in European history. This next thing, you can write it down if you want to, but it's not necessary. You can actually screenshot it or something like that when I'm done explaining it if you just want like a little infographic to study. But we got to talk about but why? So we got to give you like an economics crash course in why all of this stuff was happening, right? Well, the biggest reason that it all boils down to is we got to increase trade, right? Columbian exchange goods are leading to the increased trade of goods and services and things going into the ports of Europe. Now, this is going to have 3 distinct reactions or results. And it's going to mean that, wait, with increased trade, we're going to need more workers available to work docks, work ships, to work for merchant guilds and things like that, which is going to lead, and also more trade is going to lead to more cash being available for banking and lending, because the more money that's coming in through the ports, they're not sitting at home with this stuff, it's going into banks and things like that. What do banks do with your money once they have it? They lend it out to other people, okay? They use it. So you've got more cash now being available for banking and lending. And also you have merchant wealth and power expanding very quickly, okay? Because they're the ones bringing in all these goods. Well, the thing about it is now that you need more workers for the increased trade, what that's going to do is it's going to begin the terminal illness of feudalism, okay? Modern day economics are going to begin to demonstrate to Western Europeans, people in like France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, like the now United Kingdom, England at the time, the Holy Roman Empire, that literally feudalism doesn't make a ton of sense anymore because we have new goods coming in, right? We don't need nobles to have these giant farms anymore and stuff like that where they produce just wheat and barley for bread and food stores. What's going to happen is also around the 1600s and the 1500s, the Dutch are going to begin actual new agricultural techniques, which is going to make it so you don't even need as many people on a farm anymore. And so now that feudalism is losing its efficiency, serfs are being freed and freed up from their entire contracts. So they're moving to cities and they're actually being paid for their labor. leading to a consumer revolution. We'll talk about that a lot going into the 1700s. Now, more cash being available means more money is available for building business, mostly in manufacturing. So because of the exploration period, you're seeing the seeds of the middle class grow, right? You're seeing, instead of there being a super wealthy population and a super poor population, we're beginning to see this middle ground territory pop up, right? These people that sometimes in France are referred to as the bourgeoisie, right? Like popping up where it's like individuals who are not of noble status, but they're also starting to make quite a bit of money, right? And then also merchant wealth and power is growing. So that means that monarchs can tax them, right? So like now that taxes on merchants increase, that's going to give monarchs more wealth, more power, and draw a lot of money away from the nobility, because we have new crops coming in that they can bring in on the merchant ships that will actually do just fine. And we don't need to grow and depend on farms of noble houses anymore, right? So again, you can take a screenshot of that real quick if you want to kind of use it as a way to get study a little, but it is going to pop up on the ATP test in one way or another. Now I got 2 more big slides to go through and then we're done. All right, so let's keep banging this thing out. Now, what are the effects of this commercial revolution? Biggest thing is you're going to see the seeds of capitalism and the rise of these things known as the companies pop up, okay? Now, last we heard, the best place to talk about the rise of joint stock companies, as they're known, okay, during this time period, is the best place to talk about this is the growth of economics in India, right? Now, the last we heard when we were talking about India in general is the Portuguese were there. The Portuguese had made it there as of 1497 under Vasco da Gama. They got all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, right? They got all the way to India. He killed a bunch of people and let their bodies wash up on the shores of India, which is really screwed up. But what it ended up happening is they started creating forts around the entire outside of the Indian coast. Now, a lot of this has to do with environmental reasons, also due to the fact that the Europeans didn't really have any want to try and go and invade the interior area of India. But the big thing about it is they set up forts on the outside so they get access spice trade ports and get these goods out of there. Well, the thing about India that you need to understand in particular is that India at the time was not, in the 1520s, as you can see, was when, of course, all this trade network is beginning to grow, is not actually a unified country, okay? Now, when we think of, economic dynamics and socio-political dynamics in the modern sense, we think of countries being united under one flag, maybe a handful of languages, and a political system that bonds them together where they are taxed efficiently, and they all have a little bit of a version of this on their own. Well, at the time, India was not like that. India was actually under the rulership of 2 different empires, the Mughal and at one point the Ashoka Empire and stuff like that. As they began to dwindle, though, you saw the pop-up of a lot of independent states led by these individuals known as Rajas, right? R-A-J, okay, is how you actually spell. A Raj was a prince, okay? So India, all the land in India was actually owned by local rulers, right, that were fragmented away from each other and also oftentimes in competition with each other. Well, here come the Dutch, the British, and the French because they're going to try and take advantage of this, right? The fact of the matter is that India was heavily fractured, and since it wasn't a unified country, meant that other Europeans like the Dutch, the British, and the French are going to see this opportunity and try to take advantage of it. And they're going to try to convince some of these other local rulers to trade with them rather than trading with the Portuguese or the Dutch or whoever or whatever. It's going to basically be a race to get to India as fast as possible. Now, just to give you a heads up as well, they were already in the neighborhood, okay? I like to use this animal every single year to talk about this a little bit. The Dutch is a really good example of them, okay? Now, India, being mostly headquartered by the Portuguese, the Dutch were already very close by. They were actually over in the islands over here to the east of India, known as the Moluccas Islands, aka the Spice Islands, and a very famous one being called Java, right? Well, the thing about it is the Dutch got there before anybody else, and they started to colonize it and try to use its area for resources, right? They started trying to use it to grow coffee. They started trying to manufacture spices from there as well. And they also apparently hunted these little animals down called civets cats, right? And apparently, in Java, civets cats are a really, really big deal and a part of their natural ecosystem. Well, the Dutch killed them, took their anal glands from them, squeezed them out, and made a musk perfume out of them, right? Well, the thing about it is that the Dutch were making money off the Java Islands, off civets cats, off coffee growing and things like that, but they wanted to make the big money, the spice money coming out of the southern area of India. So what they did is they created a sovereign trade company. Now, what that means is it's a company that's not regulated by a government, right? Now, this is a big deal, okay? Because if you have a trade company regulated by the government and you start a fight, now you've got an international war on your hands, right? But instead, the Dutch created this thing known as the East India Company, right? Around 1600, they created a company that is a sovereign joint stock company. Now, what that means is a bunch of Dutch merchants pooled all their boats together. And basically, in essence, forever how many boats you donated to this joint stock company is however many shares of the profit you got. Effectively, in this process, when they created this thing known as the East India Company, known by its brand marking the V, the O, and the C, you just created the stock market, right? So because literally you get a certain share of all the profits depending on how much you invested in the company, right? Now the thing about it is that the Dutch send their East India Company over to India to start ousting some of the Portuguese, to pay off some of these Rajas and stuff like that. Oh, don't play with the Portuguese. Play with us, right? Except we'll actually come here and we'll protect you from other people. We'll give you these other goods. We'll do these other things. And we're showing up with more boats, more people, more power, right? And the other thing about it is the Rajas sometimes agreed. And of course, who's also going to catch wind of this? A few years later, the British are going to create their own version of it, known as the British East India Company. And there was even a French one. The French East India Company was created as well, which doesn't have nearly as cool of a logo, which is really, really sad. But the thing about it also is the French East India Company kind of fell under its own weight a little bit later on. But these two bad boys right there survived for a very, very long period of time. And it's going to begin a massive race to get to India as fast as they possibly can. And we'll elaborate more on these companies more and more. If you have any questions about what a joint stock company is and stuff like that, take a little sticky note out real quick, write on it, slap it inside your notes and be like, I need to ask this during the warm-up because I don't quite get it. Remember, this is a big thing about getting it, not just trying to remember it, okay? Now look, so big thing about it though is the creation of these companies is going to begin to force the Portuguese out, right? It's going to start forcing them out, and the Indian Ocean, basically in a nutshell later on, gets kind of the market cornered by the Dutch and the British, right? And as you can see, when all these companies start showing up, you can see that there are different flags all over the place. Dutch settlements, French settlements, and British settlements going all the way around, starting around the year 1600, when the creation of the East India Companies actually popped up. Now, again, the big thing about it is, like if you go with us to Amsterdam and stuff like that, we'll talk a lot about that, and on a walking tour through the city, we'll actually go see the building where the Dutch East India Company was actually started, which is really, really cool. Now, anyway, so going into it though as well, you have to understand, back over in North America though, this is the other element of like the growth of consumerism and then also like intense trade economics as well. Now, what we got though going on back in North America, we got the final colonization by the English and the French, okay? Now, those early settlements in the 1490s to the 1570s didn't really work out very well because the French and the English couldn't survive the hectic climate, right? Well, then right around the turn of like the mid-1500s to the late 1500s, you're going to see them starting to take a gamble and daring to try and create some colonies, right? Well, the French create theirs around Canada, Mississippi. They use the Mississippi River and the Louisiana territory. And we'll talk about those things here in a couple seconds. Whereas the English set theirs up on the Atlantic coast, going from about where you would believe, like in the modern era, Massachusetts, all the way down to Georgia, right? Now, the original settlements, one of them didn't work out. The Roanoke colony, founded originally in the 1580s, is not going to work out very well, and they lose it, all right? We'll talk about that one a little bit in class as well. Sir Walter Raleigh actually set up a colony in Roanoke, which is now modern-day North Carolina. Big field trip destination for us kids when we were growing up in North Carolina was to go to the Roanoke colony, and it's still there, but there were no people there. And of course, he shows up and everyone's gone, and the only thing left behind was a carving in a tree that just said Croatan, right? And we believe that the Native Americans actually might have killed them and dragged their bodies and remains off. Now, the Jamestown colony is going to be started around 1604, and Jamestown colony is going to be created as well in Jamestown, Virginia, named after King James I, actually, which we'll talk about in the 1600s as well. That's a joint stock colony, and it was actually started by the Virginia Company is what it's called, and that's why Jamestown literally ends up being a city inside of Virginia. And the joint stock colony was a bunch of English merchants that, just like the East India Company, invested in this colony, and what they ended up finding that made them tons of money was we'll talk about here in 2 seconds. The Plymouth colony, though, also was another big one as well. It's the Massachusetts Bay colony that starts around 1620, and it's going to be the Pilgrims that are actually there, but they're not really Pilgrims in a sense. We call them that as Americans, but the big thing about it, and we call them that as Americans because we're taking their side of the story, they're actually Puritan separatists is what they are. But then eventually they started settling Maryland, which is the colony of Catholics, Pennsylvania, and the thing that you need to understand about English colonies is that they made a lot of money and they had a huge population. And the biggest thing that they made money off of was this stuff, the discovery of tobacco, right? The discovery of tobacco and like tobacco goods is going to make England a ton of money. And then also, you have to understand as well, English colonists were entire families of people. People like trying to go further away with entire families, mom, dad, and then kids were as well were going there, and they were planning on living there for the rest of their lives. Whereas on the flip side, French colonies, their early settlements are going to be in Montreal, Quebec, and then also in Louisiana, using the Mississippi River as a tunnel, or basically a thoroughfare or a highway, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, okay? Louisiana, of course, its original colony being that of New Orleans, founded in 1712. All of these different areas, though, are going to be very low population and not make tons of money. And the big reason why is because when whole families were going to settle English colonies and farm tobacco and then send all those goods back, in France, it was mostly what's known as journeymen, right? Journeymen that would be sent over, or that would go over to Montreal, Quebec, hunt beaver and muskrat and fur trap and things like that. But then they would eventually go back to France and then sell all the things that they had found. And the other big one as well, just to give you an example, is Louisiana's colony of New Orleans was doing so badly at one point and not making any money. They couldn't grow anything there except indigo. They literally were doing so poorly, they had to empty out the jails of France and then send people like debtors, thieves, and prostitutes to go found places like New Orleans because they couldn't make enough money off of it and they couldn't get anyone to stay. All right, so like now, there's one place though that they made tons of money off of, the French colony, and it's the islands they had in the West Indies, particularly Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, right? So now, last but not least, looking forward, though, if we take a gander at this map, what you're going to see is we got some different colonial areas rubbing up next to each other, right? We got some overlap here. We got the Spanish that are rising up throughout like Florida, and then also Mexico as well. Looking forward, though, by the 1700s, this is going to break out into war. All right, so like just to give you a heads up, there is going to be a massive colonial war. Those that you could actually argue are the War of Spanish Succession, and then also later on, the French and Indian War will break out between these colonies and these different countries because they can't agree on who gets what. All right, so but that's where we're going to cut it. That's it right there. And then when you come into class next, we're going to talk about the Reformation. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.